Today, we take a step back from the news to gain a new perspective and attempt to make reading great again with the review and discussion of the book Jesus and John Wayne. I'm Charles Randolph, and welcome to Speak Online, where we seek out good sources of information and gain new perspectives on modern day events and the media. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate all your support. So, let's watch and reflect. Before we move forward, I am an Amazon associate. Recommending books and sources of good information are my thing. Please check out the description for a list of current book recommendations. Links in the description below. Now, Jesus and John Wayne, the New York Times bestseller written by Dr. Kristen Kolbis-Dumais, professor of history at Calvin University, provides a very detailed account of, and I quote, how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. Now, some may recoil after that description, and I urge you not to. This book does not bash religion, nor do I intend to do so. It is a historical account of how individuals within the evangelical faith have used sources of media, for example, books, films, and music, to influence the beliefs of millions to push, in my opinion, a theocratic political agenda. This book will elucidate the use of media to influence public opinion. Tonight, I will go through this book based on some of my written annotations and thoughts. So, moving forward, because you're probably like, Charles, what does Jesus and John Wayne have to do with anything? I think we all are aware of Jesus's role in politics, yes, but perhaps not John Wayne. So, let me hook you a little bit and show you what we got here. So, I was watching a recent stream from the Oval Office, and it was just after reading this book, and I couldn't believe what I noticed. Now, look closely at what is behind President Trump. Imagery and symbolism are extremely powerful tools, especially in politics. Take a look at this desk. Do you see the cowboy holding his hat, on a horse? The classic imagery of what a cowboy is and what it's associated with, okay? Donald Trump, the cowboy. And if you think of his behavior and how that reflects with that image, it's very, very interesting. Now, that might not be enough to get the point across. So, I pulled up a video. And this video is where Donald Trump speaks at John Wayne Birthplace Museum in Iowa. I was really so surprised at just how important this really is. I couldn't believe it. I was amazed. I had no idea that this was even a thing.
Trump is because America needs help, and we need a strong leader, and we need someone like Mr. Trump with leadership qualities, someone with courage, someone that's strong, like John Wayne. And I'll tell you what, if John Wayne were around, he'd be standing right here instead of me. So with that, I just want you to welcome Mr. Donald Trump.
That is so, come on, get right next to me. John Wayne would be very, very proud of you right now. I think, maybe he would say, what are you doing? But John Wayne would be, and I'll tell you what, I've been a long-time fan. And this all began when I came here, and I was so fascinated, and I really didn't want to leave. There's so much to see.
Isn't that amazing, though? The leadership qualities that are associated with the cowboy. I find it very, very interesting, and it's amazing the effect that it has on the public as well. Okay, so let's get into the book itself. Now, a few things that I'd like to note, because I looked at this from very much of like a media literacy standpoint. And although it's not discussed in particular, when I mention such things such as like the preachers that are discussed in this book, think of when I say that rather than the preacher, an influencer, because we are in a very interesting time right now where people don't necessarily see a preacher, at least those that aren't associated with religion in that, population, but our modern preacher is the influencer. They truly are. And they are able to reach an audience so vast that do not fall into that religious category. It's really, really amazing. And then also when it comes to like the political side as well, when it, like with the voting in particular, think of a vote as not necessarily like an individual, but a product that's on the shelf. Okay. Because when it's discussing these associations that are made, it's a brand. Okay. You see a product on a shelf, you see different things associated with it. Okay. Like the strong leader, the masculine individual. These types of qualities, they sell to the public and it buys votes. So just a couple things that I'd like to have in mind, or just to a well-informed and educated public is one of the greatest threats. And I think to the powers that be, but it strengthens our democracy a great deal. And I really, really value it. And right now there's so much bad information out there that the more that we can get and the more critical thinking, I believe is very, very important right now. In the introduction, it starts off on a description of when Donald Trump was inaugurated on January 2016. It mentions his amazing claims regarding how many people were there. And I think we all remember that quite well. There were comments regarding how important religious liberty is and other attractive qualities that came along with what he preached were these qualities of militant masculinity. And one of the things that comes with militant masculinity is this patriarchal authority. Now, a lot of people will recoil from the idea of patriarchy. I know that it's not, it's seen now and framed as basically you're a wuss if you believe in patriarchy, if it's a thing. But it's not about that. It's really not. What it's associated with is more of like the head of household, the woman being subordinate to the man. Another big thing that came along with this that I never really thought of too much was the idea of like Christian nationalism. The belief that America is God's chosen nation and must be defended as such. I never really thought of the militancy that was associated with such a belief, and how that can be linked to like a pro-authoritarian type of style of government. And we're really seeing that right now with some of the disregarding of the judicial branch. It's very, very interesting. Another big point here was, how people self-identified with these beliefs and behaviors. Some of these, I think many who weren't part of this population considered them to be gone. And even some within the Christian population as well. There is dissent among some of these old beliefs and current. It really discusses how much like theological convictions have this association with theological fundamentalism, the pop culture, and Christian nationalism and racial identity. We've seen identitarianism really pick up, and one individual in particular that comes to mind is Richard Spencer. He was a big one. He managed to get media attention despite some of the extreme beliefs by simply being pro-white race. And he wouldn't necessarily claim that he was a Christian, but he would say that he's a cultural Christian. And that was a big push. We've seen this link of militant Christianity to the culture war. It really reminded me of Ben Shapiro with his religious and political comments. Another thing was how like the populist nationalism theme takes power from these old school priests in a way. We come to some of the wonderful, wonderful qualities of slogans with Making America Great Again and the use of products to shape the faith that these evangelicals inhabit. I never knew just how big I don't really want to call it propaganda. I feel like it's kind of denouncing the value of it, especially to those who believe in it. But the market value that is available to those who want to make money off the Christian population, the amount of books that are sold that it mentions in this is just absolutely amazing. Read this quote. In this way, militant masculinity linked religious and secular conservatism, helping to secure an alliance with profound political ramifications. For some evangelicals, these militant heroes would come to define not only Christian manhood, but Christianity itself. Close quote there. Very much there was an association made between family values and male authority, the influence of Christian media and merchandise. Here's a quote. The reassertion of white patriarchy was central to the new family values politics, and by the end of the 1970s, the defense of patriarchal power had emerged as an evangelical distinction. The media and the merchandise is absolutely huge. And also, one thing that comes throughout this book is, this pendulum that kind of swings back and forth. It's so interesting as like generations of time goes by, we forget some of these things that were associated with religion. So it almost becomes like a new thing, but it's really not. It was just 30 years ago. And it's taking those old beliefs and reapplying it. Like someone who sat back and read a book and was like, hey, you know what? This worked a long time ago. Let's try it again. It's really, really interesting. The submissive femininity, that was huge. This is good. Across 2 millennia of Christian history and within the history of evangelicalism itself, there is ample precedent for sexism, racism, xenophobia, violence, and imperial designs. I'm reading another book right now called The Myth of American Idealism, which I only picked up because one, I am an American idealist, and two, I've always strayed away from Mr. Chomsky because of some of his beliefs, definitely challenging mine, but I figured it was a good time to have some of those beliefs challenged, so I picked it up. But when it mentions this imperial designs, it's very interesting if you look at the foreign policies that America has actually supported. The public believes one thing, but our foreign policy demonstrates another. It demonstrates another. So moving into chapter 1, I'll start here with a quote. By the early 20th century, Christians recognized that they had a masculinity problem, unable to shake the sense that Christianity had a less than masculine feel. Many blame the faith itself, or at least the feminization of Victorian Christianity, which privileged gentility, restraint, and an emotive response to the gospel message. This is huge. You know, we consistently hear about the wussification so much of the population, the political correctness, all these big talking points in politics. This was very interesting. When it talks about this feminization, it links it to the economy, which I found to be a fantastic observation. Because as we moved to a different economy, like one separate from manufacturing, one more focused on service, let's say, men moved out of the construction workforce and began moving into the office. You go from, wearing jeans, picking up your hammer, going and working on stuff, to going to the office in a suit. And that is perceived as less masculine. It's very interesting thinking about how our economy changes that. Discusses more of the religious merchandising and how preachers, such as one that's noted here as Sunday himself, effectively used consumerism to push some of these old-time religious beliefs. It notes that these liberal Protestants also tended to emphasize the social and environmental dimensions of Christianity over against fundamentalists' more individualistic focus on personal sin and conversion. Fundamentalists, in turn, accused modernists of abandoning this historic Christian faith. When it mentions these liberal Protestants, this really reminded me of a movement that occurred, I want to say it was probably about 10 years ago, with the rise of Dave Rubin, Tim Pool, and some of these other individuals. They hold no real distinct position. They are very wishy-washy, but they claim that they are these classical liberals, right? And I feel like they took that liberal vote and pushed it to the conservative side, to the right side. And that is where the Republican Party got those extra votes. This primarily discusses it just within the religious sphere, but I think that people like Tim Pool and Dave Rubin were able to grab a either non-denominational or secular portion of the public to vote on the right. Because if you watch their content, they are totally conservative. They don't want to be quote unquote put in a box, but they are conservative as hell. And I'm not knocking conservatives or Republicans or whatever. I'm just saying that they're full of shit. They really are. They really are. And they're Russian propagandists. But that's another topic. Anyway, moving forward onto this discussion of modernists and these old school fundamentalists. So, modernists and fundamentalists did, however, agree on the need to masculinize the faith, Liberal Protestants insisted that their own social activism exemplified a manly exercise of Christianity. Fundamentalists, meanwhile, asserted that a staunch defense of doctrine evinced masculine courage and conviction, and they decided liberal theology as an effeminate squandering of the virality of true Christianity. Excuse me, I believe that's pronounced virility of true Christianity. I very much agree with the effectiveness of this masculinization. If the Democrats were to take back, and I think that they could do it without bringing masculinity into it too much, rather, if they reclaimed the patriotic image, if the Democrats, whenever they got online, they had the American flag behind them. Because if you look at all these influencers on the right, what do they have? They got the American flag, they got the gun, all that kind of stuff. If they were to get that image back, it would change things up quite a bit. At least I think. Let me know what you think. There's a good quote here by Sherwood Eddy, a leading liberal Protestant proponent of the war that was going on, expressed dismay at his pro-war activism. I believe, quote, that it was a war to end war, to protect womanhood, to destroy militarism and autocracy, and to make a new world fit for heroes to live in, he confessed. The carnage and horrors of warfare put an end to all of that. I thought that was an interesting one. They move on to, quote, to launch the offensive, a group of fundamentalist leaders came together in 1942 to form the National Association of Evangelicals, NAE. Their choice of the word evangelical was strategic. So this is discussing how the evangelical movement began. Quote, aware of their image problem, fundamentalists knew they needed to rebrand their movement. It's all about branding. This is what I mentioned earlier, right? The fact that some of the more militant fundamentalists had started their own organization, the American Council of Christian Churches, under the leadership of fundamentalist Carl McIntyre, helped with this project, enabling the NAE to distance itself from more reactionary elements. This is something I was never aware of, but the amount of organizations that are around are extensive. I didn't even know that there was a CBN, a Christian Broadcasting Network. It is just an entire sphere that I was very ignorant to, and I was not aware of the amount of influence that these individuals had. I had this old-time image of, a preacher in a church, not this more modern consumerist type of religion with such a broad reach. It really was very eye-opening. Now this is great. We get into Billy Graham, who came about in the 40s. Now this man, he's what did it. His image. They have, and I'll show you so you can see it. Oh, it's out of focus. I can't get it too close, but what it is it has this guy on his stage, good hair, he's good looking, and he's energetic. He's getting that crowd going. He's bringing back that masculinity, and he really tied together this whole, John Wayne type of thing. He did a really good job with it, and he branded it. I'll read this to get a little bit more of a historical context and time frame. In the fall of 1949, however, Graham's future was uncertain. Harboring doubts about the authority of the Bible, he began to question whether God might be calling him to a different path. It was on a particularly dark night of the soul that Graham, open Bible before him, resolved to set his intellectual difficulties aside and surrender completely to the authority of God's word. He later recalled waking up with a renewed sense of purpose as he prepared for his upcoming visit to Los Angeles, refreshed with the vision that, quote, something unusual was going to happen there. And he was right. He was right. The movement that he began, and I'll say like the social movement in particular, was huge. Make this note and quote, all this was only a faction of an emerging evangelical infrastructure that would come to support a vibrant religious consumer culture. Here's an example of some of these organizations that are noted and institutions. Wheaton College, Fuller Seminary, the National Religious Broadcasters, the NAE, Campus Crusade for Christ, Young Life, and Fellowship of Christian Athletes. You notice how some of these are in college or on college campuses? One thing to note about social movements, one of the best ways to do it is to begin it on a college campus. It's very effective. Very effective. Okay. Moving forward, this goes into a bit of like a discussion of Christian bipartisanship. You know, some of these like separations or other groups within the faith. So, I'll quote this. Contemporary evangelical partisanship can only be understood in terms of a broader realignment that transformed partisan politics from the 1950s to the 1980s. A realignment that evangelicals themselves helped bring about. At the heart of this realignment were attitudes towards civil rights, the war in Vietnam, and family values. Excuse me. For conservatives, a defense of white patriarchy emerged as a unifying thread across this range of issues. For conservative evangelicals, a defense of white patriarchy would move to the center of their coalescing culture and political identity. And that continues to now. That discussion of identitarianism, that is huge. The fear that white people have of our race, you know, going away due to interracial marriages, sex, kids, is huge. There is a huge fear of that. And I really wonder where that stands, you know, like where that comes from. That's like almost like a biological imperative that we have this inherent fear. It's interesting. I'd like to know what you think about that. Here's a note that Billy Graham, he made the connection explicit. A strong military would keep Americans free to worship their God. Yes, that was huge. The military strength provides religious protection. It keeps these outsiders away. It's a defense of faith. It truly is. It truly is. And we see this a lot going on in Europe as well. A lot. They are facing many of some of the same issues. And I recently found out that much of the propaganda that is promoted, like from Russia, are these far-right identitarianists, these nationalist types of beliefs. Very interesting. Takes money. This goes to the 1950s, a comment regarding that. But by the 1950s, the baby boom was in full swing, and the traditional family appeared to be flourishing. The nuclear family structured around a male breadwinner was in fact of recent invention, arising in the 1920s and peaking in the 1950s and 60s. Before then, multi-generational families relying on multiple contributors to the family economy had been the norm. You know, the 1950s, that baby boom, you know, those traditions, those were huge, and it had an amazing effect on the population. And it's so interesting how in time, you know, just with like a generation or two, we can forget prior traditions that were so once important to us. Orwell, I think he had a phrase for this. It was like the memory hole, something along those lines, where it's just we forget and we choose to forget. This brings about the 1960s and 1970s, and I quote, "Then conservative evangelicals would be drawn to a nostalgic, rugged masculinity as they looked to reestablish white patriarchal authority in its many guises. Over time, the defense of patriarchy and growing embrace of militant masculinity would come to define both substance and symbol of evangelical cultural and political values." So this patriarchy combined with cultural and political values, it starting to come about in the 1960s, I mean, that was such a definitive time. Such a definitive time. The idea of this quote unquote like culture war coming about then, I would really need to talk to some people who were alive at that time to really determine if that was about. It was too long ago. I'd have to look up some of the news from them. But it's interesting that it occurred back then. Just because we see these themes come up in our generation recently in history, and finding out the origin was so long ago, it's interesting. This goes into the civil rights movement. I'll quote this. To white Americans who were willing to listen, the civil rights movement argued that America had never been a country of liberty and justice for all. Evangelicals' response to civil rights varied, particularly in the early stages of the movement. It is easily forgotten, but some evangelicals, especially those who would come to constitute the evangelical left, were vocal supporters of civil rights. Absolutely, and I think this is very important to note, to give credit where credit is due, that there was so much conflict going on within the church, within the believers themselves, between some of these beliefs that, we don't promote, that there is very much a large group of people that are pro civil rights. And I think it's easy for us to forget. And I heard a really good comment kind of explaining one of the reasons why Trump won is because, the left were calling these people deplorable. So if you label and call these people, horrible people, which they aren't, might disagree with them, but most of them aren't deplorable. Who are they going to vote for? Who? They're going to vote for the other guy. Guarantee it. I probably would, just because it pisses you off. There was a good quote here from W.A. Criswell of the First Baptist Dallas, Robert Jeffrey's future home. And he quotes, "A denial of all that we believe in." And that is regarding to some of these civil rights activism that was occurring during that time. It notes the Civil Rights Act that came around 1964. This is a line that I've definitely adopted. I find it very good. This is regarding Mary. I'm just going to read this portion. First up was Marion Miller, a housewife who had gained fame crusading for anti-communist education in public schools and for infiltrating the Los Angeles left as an FBI informant. Next up was Ronald Reagan, still a Democrat. At that time, Reagan warned of communists' devious plans to target teenagers, quote, rebellious nature, close quote, fooling them into thinking that their patriotism is hollow. Isn't that a good statement? I find that very catchy. Patriotism is hollow. Very good. It's amazing that, segregation was not that long ago, only around like 1963. It's crazy to think how much has changed in such a short period of time culturally. And I think that is one of the reasons why some of the issues are around today. Social media in general, it changes things so quickly. It injects these ideas and they spread so fast that I think a lot of this stuff is just so shocking, you know? It's so shocking to so many people. It's like, whoa, you want me to just believe this all of a sudden? Like, come on, chill out. Like, work me up to it. An individual named Goldwater, he really came into the picture. I'll quote this: Goldwater had recommended withdrawing from the UN and appeared open to provoking nuclear war. Opponents tarred him a warmonger and an extremist, to which Goldwater famously retorted, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. And I believe the reason why I quoted that is because there was a recent tweet that came out by President Donald Trump that very much parroted that belief. That as long as it's in line with what will benefit America, then it's justified. And that's somewhat of a scary thought. I mean, that's one, assuming that, you actually have the U.S. best interests at heart. But, yeah, it's a scary thought. Brings in a new character, Wallace Henley, who reached out to Bill Bright, head of Campus Crusade, to convince him to join in a media strategy to advance the conservative cause. And this is big. And I'm quoting, by media strategy, Henley meant doing things like syndicated news columns, developing evangelical-orientated radio and television spots, undertaking a specific effort to land some of the big names on Christian talk shows. The possibilities were vast. One thing that often came up in here was, I never thought of like Bill O'Reilly as or just like a lot of these different media personalities as individuals pushing an agenda, that just because they were Christian, that they were pushing an agenda, but it really is. And they really are pushing an agenda when they're on there and, they're speaking their faith, which I don't have a problem of. But it makes you question, like, is this actually, news in the first place? Like, is this a Christian broadcasting network? In other words, it really makes you think about the frame that they are going to portray in the news because of a personal agenda that they wish to push. It goes into the anti-war left. Quote, the anti-war left, though often disparaged by evangelicals, was in fact animated in part by religious faith. Mainline clergy condemned American war crimes and called into question the morality of war and that of American soldiers. I'll make a note here about a fantastic word that I recommend picking up. And it means to repeat the same message, that being inculcating. Very good. And I think it really applies to many influencers who continue to push a similar theme. For example, division over and over and over again. And what impact that has on the audience. A message of division within the public. It has an effect. It really does. A comment about, or at least my comment about how preachers are now replaced with influencers, which I truly believe that, especially now that you can actually see church services on YouTube even more. This is my comment regarding making a meme about Billy Graham on one side and influencers on the other, which I did do. Moving forward, in this way, militant masculinity linked religious and secular conservatism. And this is quoting, in time, the two would become difficult to distinguish. Very true. As red-blooded American manhood became infused with God and country virtues, otherwise secular models would come to exemplify an ideal Christian manhood. This conflation of religious and secular can be seen in the cult-like status John Wayne enjoyed among American conservatives in the 1960s and 1970s. I have never watched a John Wayne film in my life. I have heard about them, and I have no idea what draws people to them, but hey, if it's your thing, go with it. There's a block quote here that I found interesting that was from John Wayne, and I'll quote, "With a lot of blacks, there's quite a bit of resentment, along with their dissent, and possibly rightly so. But we can't all of a sudden get down on our knees and turn everything over to the leadership of the blacks. I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility. I don't believe in giving authority and positions of leadership and judgment to irresponsible people." So here's something really I feel important to think about, and that is the examples that are set by who we look up to. So this individual that is so key on a political level, and you could say religious as well, that is his belief. And it's interesting to see how those beliefs continue forward. This mention of there's quite a bit of resentment along with their dissent. I believe that there is a great fear embedded in some of the white American population of, like blacks resenting whites, a fear that they're going to get back at us. You hear the discussion of like reparations and such like that. It's interesting to see how those themes continue forward. And it moves to a little bit more of a discussion regarding women and their association to men when it comes to marriage or just in general. A woman named Maribel Morgan, with her book The Total Woman, was significant in the past, and it discussed a lot, and I'll quote this section. To begin with, it was important for women to keep up their curb appeal, to look and smell delicious, to be feminine, soft, and touchable, not dumpy, stringy, or exhausted, at least if they wanted husbands to come home to them. But that was just the beginning. To keep a husband's interest, Morgan was a strong believer in the power of costumes in the bedroom, or kitchen, living room, or backyard hammock. So that when a husband opened the door each night, it was like opening a surprise package. One day a smoldering sex pot, another an all-American fresh beauty. A pixie, a pirate, a cowgirl, or a showgirl. Contrary to popular belief, Morgan never recommended that women clothe themselves in nothing but saran wrap. That'd be interesting. But she wasn't sure where the rumor got its start, though she conceded it was a great idea. I don't know. Cling wrap is extremely hard to unpeel. It would be a real pain in the ass. But anyway. This was a big one. And I'll quote this. This came from her. If you are stingy in bed, he'll be stingy with you. Give him what he wants and he'll give back to you. And by that, she meant tangible gifts like a new refrigerator, a whole new wardrobe, or a cruise to the Bahamas. This is a very interesting, I would say, counter often a lot of their beliefs or the values that they want to do, because it's sex for money. It really is. It's sex for money. Saying, hey, I'll do this or that, and I get that new fridge or that wardrobe. It's very true. Very true. And it goes counter so many of their values. This brings up some of the issues that are associated with equality of rights. And I heard an interesting argument regarding segregation when it came to like bathrooms. I'll read this block quote. Opponents' fixation on unisex bathrooms caught many feminists off guard, but it pointed to deeper social anxieties that this new movement for equal rights was tapping into. It also prefigured the furor on the right, and the evangelical right in particular, over transgender people and bathrooms in our own time. An interesting argument I recently heard was from Neil deGrasse Tyson about like when he's seen the segregation or when he's seen the separation of bathrooms, like these placards that go on here. What he's seen, what it reminded him of was segregation. And I'd never thought of it that way. But that is an enlightening perspective that I had never taken on before or seen that, most likely due because of the fact that I'm white and I don't see that segregation occurring, or excuse me, I have never experienced that segregation. But it's an interesting thought. It really is, that it is similar to segregation. I think that's an important thought to consider, because we look at it, many of us, and just see, that's male and that's female. But someone with a different life experiences takes a look at that with the current political issues at hand, and they perceive it as segregation. Very interesting. Good thought. Whether you agree or disagree, it's a very enlightening thought to have, and I think it's important to have in the public. It goes more into the social movements of those in those of the Christian faith, pushing the female submission theme into the public. A lot of this reminded me, like hearing some of this consumerism, of a South Park episode where the young kids, they started a Christian rock band because Cartman, wanted to make $1 million. And, it portrayed it as this consumerist culture. And I thought it was just a joke, but it's true. It was a good piece of political satire. Very good. Mentions George Lakoff, which caught my attention because he is an excellent author, and I did a lot of research on him during college. Recommend looking into some of his books. Again, it will give you a different perspective on the use of language in the media. In particular, like the political affiliations being connected to certain societal metaphors. This goes into slaves and soldiers. Discussion of like family values, politics, sex, and authority. The male patriarchy, the discipline of children. One of the things that comes up now is, at least with parents, do you have the right to spank your kid? It's interesting. I'll quote, fundamentally, evangelical family values entailed the reassertion of patriarchal authority at its most basic level. Family values politics was about sex and power. I thought that was a very interesting observation. Sex and authority. And quote, in the home, fathers discipline children and husbands exercise authority over wives. In the case of husbands and wives, this authority could be administered in the most intimate of ways. Beyond the home, the power of the patriarch ensured the security of the nation. In the aftermath of Vietnam, this required a renewed commitment to militarism. Family values politics then involved the enforcement of women's sexual and social subordination in the domestic realm and the promotion of American militarism on the national stage. Oh, this was very, very interesting. Some of you may have heard of the Left Behind books. They're extremely popular. His name is Tim LaHaye. He is I would call a Christian fundamentalist. He has authored many, many books, and let's see, this came all the way back in 1968. LaHaye published a guide to marriage with the curious but telling title, How to Be Happy Though Married. The book promoted male headship, the notion based on New Testament teachings that the husband was the head of the wife, that he had authority over her, and was responsible for her. For LaHaye, this was particularly relevant in matters of finances. In addition to other mundane topics, LaHaye included a chapter on physical joys that contained a helpful glossary of terms. I never knew that he was associated with that at all. It's amazing. I wonder how much of those who read his books know this and how it would affect it. And apparently, the themes within his books carry that message of female subordination as well. Quote, he blamed American news stations for their biased coverage of the Vietnam War, for constantly twisting news reports to make America appear the aggressor. This is interesting. I put why fake news appeals to the right, but I think that's incorrect, because I haven't looked at how the left has portrayed other things. And now that I'm looking at this new book, it appears to be ubiquitous across both sides. He brought up premillennialists tended to see America, like any other nation, as doomed to destruction. Reconstructionists, on the other hand, were postmillennialists who believed Christians needed to establish the kingdom of God on earth by bringing all things under the authority or dominion of Christ before Christ's return. And this is very interesting, especially when it comes to politics. If those beliefs would definitely affect foreign policy. It discusses how anti-communism is very much pushed. More about militant masculinity. I thought it was interesting in this book. I'll read this. In 1976, the year of America's bicentennial, he had organized a series of I Love America rallies, elaborately choreographed performances staged on the steps of state capitals across the nation. And this was by Falwell. What I find interesting is how much President Trump's rallies, and I'd have to think about this too with the left, but how similar they are to this quote-unquote rally, you know? I wonder how much he thought of, hey, let's repeat these behaviors now because they worked then. I'm not sure if that's the case, but someone within his sphere may know of this. This was interesting. I wonder how many times I've said that now. The Domestic Violence Act was especially insidious, for it would do away with physical punishment as a mode of child rearing and eliminate the husband as head of the family. Another bill pending in the Senate, S-1722, at that time would enable women to sue husbands for rape, he claimed. Isn't that interesting at how domestic violence being reduced in the home would threaten these patriarchal beliefs that are embedded within the Christian culture? I would never think that at all, that would be some sort of threat. It's very interesting, though, to think about how some of the policies that we push can actually be seen as a threat. I mean, I wasn't alive then, but I wonder what the discussion would be like within the public regarding that. Now we would consider it absolutely crazy, but it'd be very interesting to look at the media then and the discussions that were being had. There was a division within the church with traditions of Christian pacifism. Again, this divide, how you have certain books of the Bible, justified certain behaviors while others did not. We see a big difference between the New Testament and the Old Testament. Falwell, he was very much for fighting a holy war. And I'll quote, "A war to resist feminism, abortion on demand, government intervention in the family, the abandonment of Taiwan, IRS interference in Christian schools, children's rights, and rampant homosexuality. The very things that had corrupted the nation's morals and blunted its ability to resist communism." He really brought political activism back. He really did. I really liked how this author provided background information on the individuals that she discussed. I think it's really, really important. She goes into, how they were raised. So, for example, like Billy Graham or Falwell, and really paints a picture of why they believe the things that they believe. And I think that's really important because it helps you understand where they got it and gives you a different perspective rather than just being like, I dislike them. It gives you a better perception of who they are and why they believe certain things. It goes into a lot of the different conferences that are consistently held, how just the amount of citizens that are involved. I found it interesting that the Panama Canal came up in this because of the fact of the recent events that have occurred regarding the Panama Canal. I'll read this. To evangelicals, Carter had been a disappointment to all counts. They denounced the Carter administration for siding with feminists and for wooing the homosexual vote. To make matters worse, Carter had overseen the conservatives perceived to be the stunning decline of American strength. On his first day in office, he had pardoned draft evaders. He agreed to hand over the Panama Canal and signed a nuclear arms control agreement. He'd allowed the Sandinistas to gain control of Nicaragua and enabled the overthrow of the Shah of Iran. Do you think there was anyone alive who was like, man, finally, we got that back. We got the Panama Canal back. Quote, Reagan was never a movie star of Wayne's caliber, but the two were similar in many ways. On screen and off, both blended myth and reality. Both had played the war hero, and among admirers, this fiction was often confused for fact. The power of image. One thing that came up a lot was when he ran, that he was tough on crime, specifically street crime, or the threat of black men. This is, a common theme that's picked up on the right, I notice. Especially focused on the minority populations in particular. The wimp factor that Reagan brought up, saying, Carter was weak, different things like that, and how Reagan projected the rugged masculine leadership. Like Nixon, quote, Reagan was adept at using racially coded rhetoric like states' rights, law and order, and forced busing to appeal to white voters. Indeed, Reagan had launched his campaign at the Neshoba County Fair, praising states' rights, just a few miles down the road from Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered in 1964, and he campaigned at Bob Jones University. By the end of the 1960s, when explicit white supremacy was no longer tenable, gender became even more significant. So true now. Until that time, Southern Baptists held varying views on gender roles. Some believed the Bible prohibited women from preaching and teaching, while others supported women's religious leadership. I made a note, I made a note here about a personal experience. I remember as a child, my mom used to take me to church, and I remember seeing that the pastor was a female. And I remember even at that young age, like 8 years old, thinking like, this is weird. It's so interesting how these beliefs get ingrained into us, even at such a young age. I just remember it being like almost uncomfortable, a very odd feeling. It goes into a discussion of how the Bible is interpreted within the faith, how some see it in one way, others another. It presses more on how, quote, Reagan didn't merely project an image of toughness as president, he translated that image into foreign policy achievements. His clear-eyed characterization of America's enemies resonated with evangelicals' conception of what was at stake in the Cold War, and his efforts to bolster American military power aligned with their yearning to restore American greatness in the post-Vietnam era. Very interesting how many evangelical books were had in the 1970s and early 1980s. Listen to some of these titles. The 1980s, Countdown to Armageddon. The Late Great Planet Earth. America at the Crossroads. It's so telling. Fear of a nuclear holocaust, being part of God's plan. Okay. Then we move to Oliver North, and I think we will end there at halfway through the book. I wasn't sure how long it was going to take me to get through one of these, but now we know. So, on that note, let me grab a cup. Gosh darn it. Cords everywhere. You go back in there. There we go. All right. Well, everyone, I have to get going. Let me know what you think about this. I'll edit it up so it's a little bit more smooth. But let me know what you think of doing these. I think getting some of this information out into the public is a good thing. I really want to promote reading as well. I think it's a very, very good thing to have in one's life. So, anyway, getting back to it, please take note that in the description, check out Ground News. There it is. You can get 40% off of a Ground News subscription. I think that makes it like $5 with my link. It's really good. I use it consistently for research, trying to find a reasonable conclusion from all the news stories that we receive. It's very useful. It's a very useful tool that I think would really benefit the public. So please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Please check us out on Spotify. Could use a little bit of support there. And we are on all social media platforms, from TikTok to Rumble to YouTube. Please check us out. I really appreciate all your support. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Bye.